are a sympathetic skeptic, or perhaps a doubting believer, then it's my guess that one of the things that gnaw at you is being expected to believe the Bible. But first, let me reassure you, in talking about this, I'm not going to try and persuade you that the Bible is true and that you should believe it or else. Instead, let's ask the direct question that goes to the heart of our doubt. What kind of sensible person would ever treat ancient literature filled with blood and guts and gore and sexism and homophobia and genocide and then still call it the Holy Bible? To me, that question is the right question. But I find that Christians fail to answer it by joining in the wrong argument. So the difficulty for me is that our culture likes to set up polarities as part of its way of debating. It's called dialectics, where one idea is set against an opposing idea. People then debate, and hopefully what happens is the truth emerges somewhere in the middle. But usually what you see is people reinforce their differences and they stay in their polarities. They don't find the truth somewhere in the middle. A good example is on discussions of the origins of the world. So, polarity one is that Christians are expected to believe creationism in the form of a kind of God created the world in 6 days versus a broad scientific rationalism that evolution created life out of millennia and out of a Big Bang. Now, the Christian's evidence, of course, is Genesis chapters 1 and 2, plus a bit of blind faith. And the scientist evidence is rocks and animals and maths and experimental evidence, and consequently any sensible person within that dialectic will dismiss Christian faith in the Bible as just superstition. But I would argue that the argument is wrong. And the question we need to discuss is not whether we believe the Bible, but how we believe the Bible. So I'd like to outline how I believe the Bible, and maybe by the end of this conversation some of you will last long enough to see that you don't have to throw away your brain to have an intellectually honest, dignifying, and creative relationship with this collection of faith writings. I'm going to ask 3 questions which take us outside that dialectic and may help you articulate how to believe the Bible without being a moral or intellectual idiot. So first question, number 1. Up to about 100 years ago, it was generally accepted that women were intellectually and morally inferior to men. That has now completely changed. Why? The answer to that is exactly how we can understand writers of the Bible. Second question. Isaac Newton was an enthusiastic alchemist. He really wanted to turn lead into gold. Along the way, he also developed the mathematical principles that underpinned the modern age. So should we disregard his discoveries on the basis of his follies? And the answer to that is exactly how we are allowed to develop our understanding of faith today. And the third question is, if you want to teach another culture to speak your language, would you start by telling them to learn yours, or would you first learn theirs so they could step into yours? And this is exactly how we are allowed to understand God's relationship with the world. Now let me expand on these 3 thoughts, but in reverse order. Let's start with God and see where we get. Now the whole point of Christian faith is that God comes to us as we are so that we can join him as he is. That's why we talk about this theological word incarnation, which simply means in the flesh. And the simple point is to discuss how we would explain economic theory to an ant. Now, if we were to do that, we would have to become some kind of human-ant hybrid, wouldn't we? And if we did it for long enough, we would learn to speak ant, we would influence ant colonies, and we would assist them in living a life that has the features of economics. So they might trade bits of leaf with termites for dead bugs or something. And then once they get the point of trade, then maybe we would say, well, let's pretend this bit of wood is a thing called money, and we'd use it as a token of exchange. And once the ants start learning that, we're away. Suddenly the ants are along the path of learning economic theory. And it's happened because we became an ant, and we spoke ant, and we did ant. And I think this is the easiest way to explain most of the Bible, of God coming to people as they are, engaging with them in their own terms, and enabling them to be more like God. And I would say that some of the gnarliest bits of the Bible are really easy to understand if we just accept that God is coming to us as we are, and then we are expressing him and our experiences as best we can. But unfortunately, it's people like us that write about it. In effect, the ants write about the economics. Now that brings us to my other points, which are better discussed while mashed together. That Isaac Newton thought silly stuff, but that doesn't mean we disregard his discoveries, and that our culture is completely shifting its ideas on the role and capability of women. We've spoken about Isaac Newton. The point's very simple, but now let's talk about the Apostle Paul, who wrote a good load of this thing we call the New Testament in the Bible. Now, as a writer, Paul draws us into rich, deep, divine thinking. He's very hard to understand, but when you get what he's doing, it's a revelation. And for loads of Christian thinkers, he's like Isaac Newton at his best. He's transformative, he's profound, and he's far-reaching. And then, because he's a man of his time, there's a point in his writings, in his letters, where he bluntly says this. He says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. And in another place he says, slaves, obey your masters. Now, our modern sensibilities recoil from this, don't they? We ask, well, what about ending slavery? And we ask, well, what about equality under God? And what you see is that Paul's tradition, embedded with the norms and perspectives of his culture, mean that however sublime his knowledge of God, he's just another ant learning economics. And sometimes all he can do is move mud around and repeat everything he's learned. But do we throw away his discoveries on the basis of his failures? We wouldn't with Newton. Why would we with Paul? Alchemy withered, but Newton's physics are still taught in our schools. And this brings us to my final point, that our culture, and with it our faith, is fundamentally redrawing its perspective on the role and capability of women. We've still a way to go, but we're getting there. We can change, we do change, and we can and do change for the better. We can review and refresh and stop repeating the worst of our antness. And if we want, we can accept that just as perspectives and truths change within and throughout the Bible, so it is with our humanity. We are allowed to think that God was at work with us through the millennia that created the Bible. We're also allowed to believe that God is active today. Maybe our perspectives have to change, and maybe we can become less ant and become more like God. Maybe it will take time, but in the meantime, let's not throw away the Bible with the bathwater.